Welcome everybody. Welcome Billy and Aoife and all of our audience members tonight. My name is Emer Hurley and I'm the Festival Director of West Cork Literary Festival. Normally I'd be making this little speech down in Bantry in the summer, and whilst we're still cautiously optimistic that might happen, it's still wonderful to be here with all of you tonight and to be able to do these online events. I suppose these events and everything else that we have been doing has been made possible by the support of our primary funders, the Arts Council of Ireland, Cork County Council and the Cork County Council Library and Arts Services, Fáilte Ireland and the Creative Europe programme of the European Union. So it's thanks to all of them and of course to our audiences that we're able to bring these events to you. Just a couple of little housekeeping things. This event will last about an hour. You'll see a chat box at the bottom of your screen that some of you are using already, where you can chat to each other and put in any comments. But there's also a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen over to the right. And if you have any questions for Billy, you can put your questions in there and Aoife will take some of those questions towards the end of the event. So just pop your questions in there. Your audience questions that you would normally ask. I'm going to hand you over to our speakers now, but first I just want to introduce Aoife Barry. Aoife is the assistant news editor and arts journalist with the journal.ie. She's also the producer of 2 podcasts, The Explainer and Get Around to It, and her essays have been published in Sunday Miscellany and Banshee. And like Billy, Aoife is also from Douglas Village in Cork City. So I'm sure that will come into their chat a little bit tonight now as well. So now I'd like to hand you over to Billy and to Aoife, and I hope you all enjoy tonight's event.
Thanks so much, Emer. And yeah, we're both from Douglas Village, and as a result, you'll hear my Cork accent after 13 years living in Dublin. It's not that strong, but it'll get progressively stronger as we go on tonight. So you have been warned. I'm so glad to be here. Thanks so much to the West Cork Literary Festival and to Emer and to Billy. I'm sure everybody here who's tuned in knows who Billy is, but Billy O'Callaghan is a short story writer and a novelist from Cork City. He's got a number of short story collections under his belt, and Life Sentences, which is out now, is his second novel. And third novel, apologies. Before, I'm never a good start getting the number of novels wrong at the start, Billy. So let's kick off though with a bit of reading from Life Sentences, because I think we were saying before we started this that you get such a good sense of a writer's work from when they read out their own work. So I'm really excited to hear you read it out, and then we'll get into all the questions.
Right. Okay, thanks Aoife, and thanks Emer for having me here. And yeah, I'm just going to read a very short excerpt from an early section of the book. The book is divided into 3 sections, 3 first-person narratives. The first is Ger, who would have been my great-grandfather. Then the next one is his mother, Nancy, who would be my great-great-grandmother. And then the third part is Nellie, who would have been my grandmother. The reason I'm picking the Ger part is because it sounds very strange if I have to read the other 2 parts. So I'm going to read just a short excerpt. And this, it's a kind of a reflective piece. It's very hard to get a sense of a novel in a short reading, but it'll give you a feel maybe for the language and for the mood of the piece. Okay. When I was a boy, I liked listening for the wind. Time has elevated that to the very sound of my childhood. Because I couldn't quite define its shape, I put my own shape to it, made an identity of the wind that was like my own, but older. And I tried in every way I could to make sense of what that meant, where it came from. I spun a revenant from the many anonymous threads of myself in an effort, I suppose, to create some sense of story, some lineage. The voice that filled the wind for me was never strong, but it was in some way familiar, like all those old songs I'd listened to and sort of knew. And searching as I was, I let myself believe that it was somehow the missing part of me, the part I'd been otherwise denied. Even now, I see myself in shards of glass and find more of a sense of identity there than I can in the shaving mirror. Standing in the cold of an early morning in our backyard, staring at my reflection, the face I see in the rust-freckled glass is a strange one, flesh laden with middle age, eyes wide in awe at having to fit myself, whoever I might be, to the tired features, skin lined by years and hanging from the scaffold of bone. The problem is that, with little knowledge of my family's line, I am largely foreign to myself. There is a name in my head that has gone unspoken for so long, Michael Egan. I have a face in mind too, thin and haggard, old-eyed, jaw like the corners of a headstone that I've carried forward with me from my childhood, one that I'd seen on maybe half a dozen occasions over as many years, and always somehow at a mile's remove, even when he and I found ourselves in the same room, barely an arm's reach apart. A face I wanted to be able to love and to have in my life and know without fear. Eyes the waxy wood-grey colour of cloud ahead of heavy rain, watching me almost by accident, and a voice, when it came, all air, as vague as something poorly remembered, or that old sighing of the wind, saying, "So you're Ger," every time, every single time, as if confirmation was necessary for both of us in order to count as fact. "So you're Ger, aren't you getting big? I hope you're being a good boy now for your mother. And stand up straight, lad. The army won't have you if you're bent." Other words too, and they're all inside me. They're all inside me because I've saved them the way a starving bird will hoard scavenged crumbs. And when I can, I take them out and repeat them, making the most of them, since they're what I have. I did this in the trenches too, and on the flat grassy plains of Bloemfontein, our battalion marching with the last of our strength out of the burnt days and into some of the reddest sunsets any of us had ever seen. A few words, the same few over and over, and features of a face that I've memorized so it's with me always, and that name, Michael Egan. Dead now, dead a long time, but one half of me then and still. I exist because of this man, but because of him I am also ruthless. I made myself strong in spite of him. Life has given me what it's given to most people I've known, occasional spans of calm that serve only to connect and intensify the turmoil. The shades might differ, but that is all. I took my first breath in a workhouse, the same as Mamie did. The Union on the South Douglas Road, a place where everyone wept until tears stopped coming, and we were all prisoners of our circumstance until someone saw fit to turn us loose. Later on, we slept on straw, Mamie and I, huddled with our mother in corners of rat-infested tenement rooms, and ate whatever was going. There were plenty like us. We were not exceptional, and we did what it took to survive. Mamie was just 2 years older than me, but while we were very close as kids, you end up going where the road takes you. By the time I got out of the army, the first time this was back in 2008, because I went in again when the Great War began, she was already married to Ned Spillane with an infant in her arms and a second on the way. I'd known of them being together from the letters she sent, and also from the things that Mary wrote. Mary, who I was at that time courting and saving what few shillings I could put by in order to wed. The letters I received from both of them were crafted in a similar hand, slow and brittle, trying to fill me in on the happenings of the village, snippets of gossip that, instead of making me feel I belonged somewhere, as was their intent, only underlined just how far away I was in every respect from those I loved. My poor mother would have written too, every day if she could, had she ever learned how. but there were times when I gladly recognized her mark, a lopsided X scratched into the bottom of Mamie's letters, in a way I chose always, though without logic or reason, to take as hopeful. I'll stop there.
That's lovely. And it gives, thanks so much for reading that for us. And I think it gives a really good sense of the themes that you discuss in the book, which I think we can get to in a bit. But
Yeah.
I wanted to start first of all with you deciding to write this, because this is heavily based on your own family story, but it's not the first time that you've written about your family. It started with writing a short story. Do you want to tell us a bit about that, and kind of about how it felt to be writing about, like, so close to yourself as well, when you usually write fiction?
Well, I mean, this is fiction in the sense that it's imagined, you know. I mean, it has to be reimagined. But I see a message there from Daisy, who's my editor. So thanks for coming, Daisy. Yeah, okay. I suppose when I think back on it now, these were the stories that turned me to writing in the first place.
Right.
This was the reason I wanted to write, I think.
Yeah.
You know. I had a story that I tried to write for many years and I could never get it right. And I eventually wrote it, and it was in my last collection of stories, The Boatman and Other Stories. And the story was called A Death in the Family. And it was a story that my grandmother had told to me when I was very little boy, probably 5 or 6 years old. My grandmother would tell me stories constantly, but this was one story that stuck with me. And I tried to write it many times, and I was never good enough to write it until I was, you know. I just kept at it, and eventually I managed to get it written. And part of the problem that I had in writing the story was trying to find a way of telling it, you know. And the key for me was when I found, when I decided that I could write it from Nellie's point of view, my grandmother. So she's telling the story. And as with the voices in this book, they're not strictly the voices of the people. You know, I mean, that wouldn't have been possible because, you know, Nancy, for example, was illiterate. You know, what you know, how would she have been able to, you know, come up with something like, you know, in the shape that it is, and make sense of it. But what I wanted to do was I wanted the voice to be the voice of your feelings, of your heart. So that's actually what the narrative voice that runs through the book is. And then the voice, it has some, you know, varied inflections from person to person, but by and large, it is a continual voice because it's meant to be, you know, running through the generations. So that was, but it was in writing that story, The Death in the Family, that it gave me a way that I could write this book. So I had to write that story before I could write this. So.
And it's, if people haven't read it, I'm sure many people watching have. It's a really, really moving story as well, and it's a very sad and beautiful short story. And I was wondering how it felt for you to explore through fiction your own family's story, because there's so many tough things that all these people go through from generation to generation. There is trauma there is loss, there is, you know, living in a workhouse, surviving the famine. It's pretty incredible, really, your family history. But I wondered how it felt for you to be exploring that. Was that difficult at times emotionally for you to do that, to kind of see and imagine what your family members went through?
It was, but at the same time, you know, it was. When I look at them now, you know, when I look back on it, I can only feel admiration for what they had to do, and it was all everything. I mean, for people that have read the book, they know what becomes of Nancy, and that she is forced into prostitution, really just as a survival mechanism. And it's something that's done for her children. It's utterly selfless, and I found that to be something that I really wanted to write about. I wanted to, it's good, I think, to have stories written about people like this, because this is, this is in a lot of people's family trees. They just don't realize it, because this was the vast majority of Ireland was this. So I while there were parts in it that were certainly difficult to write, it was, I suppose that when I was writing it, I was writing it for myself. And that's what I really, the way I've approached everything. I'm never, I never have any confidence in what I'm doing while I'm doing it. I'm just doing it to make sense of it and to explore it. And it's only as it eventually starts to get into some shape that, I start thinking about the possibilities of it going out into the world. By which time it's done, and there's no point in, crying over spilt milk. Then the damage is done. So, but so I didn't, while I was writing it, I didn't worry too much. I actually loved writing it. I have to say, I really, I couldn't wait every day to get to the page to work on it. So, which is the dream, really, isn't it? To be working on something that feels really necessary for you to write. It's structured in 3 parts. And you tell three different people's stories, kind of interlocking stories, I suppose, in many ways. Was it very clear to you from the start what the structure would end up being, or was that something that kind of came about in the edit? When I write, people have said to me in the last couple of years, you're writing so fast. I actually write extremely slowly. I just spend hours and hours every day writing. So it happens very slowly. And I rewrite as I write. I find that I need it right, in some workable shape before I can move on. So especially at the beginning, I find it's very slow. When I started writing this, initially my intention was only to write Ger. Right. The opening section when I first started it, because I had finished the Death in the Family story, and I thought that was quite a long story. I think it was about 10 or 1,000 or 10,000 words or 11,000 words, something like that, which is pretty long for a short story. And I thought I was going to do something along those lines with Ger, and I was going to, and that was my initial aim. But once I started writing it, I was probably about 7,000 or 8,000 words in, and I started to realize I'm going to have to tell Nancy's story to make sense of Ger's story. And then once I had decided that, I knew I was going to finish it with Nellie's story. So reasonably early on, I started to get a sense of what the book was going to be. So that was it. That's the answer. And like we said at the start, the two of us grew up in pretty much the same area in Douglas Village. If people don't know it, it's in Cork City, and it is a village that's kind of grown out to become almost part of the city itself. It's not a place I ever thought I'd see appearing in a literary novel, but it clearly lends itself to very interesting stories being told about it. But what's interesting is you get to go back in life sentences and write about it before you lived there, and also when you lived there as a kid. But did you do
research into what Douglas Village used to be like, or did you kind of know these things from chatting to relations about it? How did the older Douglas kind of come together in your mind as you're writing?
Well, first of all, you know, I'm 46, and Douglas, the changes that happened in Douglas, when I was a child, Douglas was still a village. It's you know, it still had a sense of being a village. It's just that housing estates had started to spring up around it. So I had a good sense of it. But as well as that, both my parents are from Douglas. My grandmother, you know, we were from here, and so I was always just listening to it. My mother was born right in the village, in Douglas Village, and so you know, even now when I walk around the place, when I walk around, and it's so changed, I can see another Douglas layered over it. You know, I can see very much the way it was closer to, I can see the way it was in my childhood, which was a lot closer to then than now, if you know what I mean. So like when I used to walk to school, say 40 years ago, it was a lot closer to the way it was 100 years ago than the way it is now. So so it didn't require a great amount of research, or maybe I had just absorbed a lot of you know, knowledge of the place from listening to people talking about it over the years. So
yeah. And take us back to young Billy. So were you someone who was scribbling stories when you were a kid, or were you somebody who loved reading and then decided to write a little bit later? I'm curious about what you were like when you were younger and how that fed into you starting to write as a career.
When I always loved to read. That was, I mean, stories, a love of stories was put into me from a very young age. We had my grandmother in the house, Nellie, when I was a child. She died when I was 7, and she would just tell me stories constantly. She was always telling me stories about her father, who became bigger and bigger in my imagination because of it, you know. I mean, she told me, you know, he had been a soldier. She was so proud of him, you know. She was so, she admired him like nobody ever admired anyone. She just thought he was a great man. And he, you know, he had been born in the workhouse, which I don't think my grandmother actually knew. You know, I mean, how much was spoken of and how much wasn't, you know. I'm not sure that she ever knew that, because she had one of her children in St. Finbarr's Hospital, which was the workhouse, you know, 100 years earlier, or however long, 80 years earlier. And I'm not sure she would have done that had she known, you know. And also the son that she had in the hospital, it's funny how, you know, how the wheel turns, and, you know, he was named Jerry after her father. So and so he was born there. My sister was born in that hospital, and I don't think, and at that stage we didn't know, you know, about him having been born in the workhouse. So this was only information that came through research. But she adored her father, and she would tell me constantly stories about him in the war, and, you know, Africa. And, you know, a lot of the stories were, you know, that he saw a mermaid swimming down the Nile and things like that, you know. But equally, she would tell me stories. Like, I remember she told me a story about when they were leaving Africa, when her father was leaving Africa on the boat. The officers had horses at the time in the war, and they had become very attached to the horses. And as the boat was leaving, the horses swam out after the boat. They had formed such attachment with the officers, and he watched. They had gone about a mile out to sea, and the horses started to get tired and, started to struggle in the water. And she said that he watched, and as the officers took their pistols out and had to shoot the horses in the water as the tears were streaming down their faces, and hearing that kind of a story as a 5-year-old child, that really leaves a deep impression on you. So I got stories from a very early age. We lived close to the library as well, so I would be up and down to the library a lot. But I actually never thought that that writing was something that somebody like me could do.
Really?
I always thought it was for people of a different class, let's say.
Wow. Did it feel like, it's out there, kind of class-based, people who are upper class or, see themselves as a certain way, that world's open to them more than it was open to you? And how did you break through that idea then of thinking that?
Well, I mean, it probably wasn't even the case. It was probably just my perception of it, to be honest with you, the Irish writers that I had read, when I was young, I wasn't that interested, I wanted to read about, Hemingway, and I was more interested in the Wild West and Africa and China and places like that. I was more interested in the world than I was around me. As a child, I did take to writers like John B. Keane and Liam O'Flaherty, people like that. I found that I liked the kind of the earthiness and the ordinariness of their characters. So that, I read everything that came my way, but I was, as a child and as a teenager, I had my own tastes. I started writing. I used to write. I actually used to write letters. I used to write letters to people. Maradona. You can see the Maradona.
Yeah.
That was my obsession. Was football, and I used to. I'd write letters to Ian Rush or Kenny Dalglish or John Byrne, people like that, and they'd never write back.
Well, what would you say to them? Because they were fan letters, but did you put more? Was it about why you were a fan, or was there more to it?
To be honest, I can't remember what was in them. I just loved it was just my way of maybe trying to connect in some way with the world. The only one that ever wrote back to me was Jack Charlton.
Wow.
Yeah. But so I used to do that, but I never I never had the courage, we'll say, to write stories until I was in my 20s. Early to mid 20s, I started writing, and when I wrote a story, and the Hollybow published it, which
is in the famous Cork. Do you want to tell people about the importance of the Hollybow to Corkonians?
The Hollybow was a Christmas newspaper, or a Christmas annual, and it would come out once a year, and it had been. I mean, the thing is running for 150 years or something. It's been around forever. But as a child, it was a really important part of childhood for me, because it sort of signaled Christmas, the sight of the Hollybow in the shop, or somebody selling it on the street. And so that when I finally published, when I had a story that I sent off to the Hollybow and they published it, I felt like, I felt a superstar. I really felt I had done, that was the height of my ambition,
Wow.
But everything is a stepping stone, and it gave me encouragement, and I wrote more, and I started collecting rejections, and and it just went from there. It went from there. It was a slow process, but it got me on the road.
Yeah, because you mentioned, getting the rejection letters there, which I think people who know a writer like yourself and what you've published presume that it was the case where you write something and then you send it off and somebody goes, brilliant, yeah, we'll publish you.
Oh,
But for like most writers, if not all writers, like most of your life is people rejecting you, not because you're not good, but because that's just how it goes. Things just didn't suit, they didn't work out.
yeah,
So
yeah.
how have you dealt with that, with like knowing that that's an integral part of being a writer, but you still have to do the work and get yourself up and get yourself at the desk and write the stories? How have you dealt with rejection through the years?
It's always a blow, but there must be something in me that's in these characters in life sentences,
Yeah.
this sort of a stubbornness and this relentlessness. And I just kept going. Nothing knocked me for long, and my feelings would be hurt, or the same as everyone, I'd react the same. But I didn't let it get the better of me. I would say I'd send my story out, and if I get a rejection, I'd send it to 2 places the same day. The rejected story. My attitude was I'll show them, and I used it, and I just, I suppose I'm lucky in that I came along at the time when the internet was just starting to open up, which revealed to me that there was a massive market for short stories in America. And I could read about them, and I could send my work to America. And that was what I did really almost from the start, more so than Ireland, because my stories were always of that length that, in Ireland we tend to only publish stories of 2,000 or 3,000 words,
Yeah.
and mine are usually, twice that length. So you're it's more difficult. But you go to America and there's thousands of places to send stories, and I just did it just through sheer perseverance, and just
Yeah.
got on to the next story and kept going.
I'm not surprised, knowing about your family background, like you say, that you have that tenacity. And just to say to anybody watching as well, we do have a Q&A section. So if you have any questions for Billy, I'll be really delighted to put them to him towards the end of the chat. So there's a box next to the chat box, Q&A. You can pop your questions there. You've written novels and you've written short story collections. Do you see yourself as primarily one type of writer above the other, or do you see yourself as just a fiction writer no matter what the kind of medium through which you're writing fiction?
Yeah, I suppose that's becoming increasingly so. For a long time I really only thought of myself as a short story writer. Short stories were manageable to me, and for a long time I was kind of afraid of the novel.
Wow.
The commitment that a novel requires as well, if you write a short story and nobody wants it, you've only wasted, a few weeks. But if you write a novel and no one wants it, you've lost a year or 2 years. So that was part of it. So I needed to kind of become a bit more confident in what I was doing. But really, it wasn't until the right idea came along that I was ready for a novel. Prior to that, I had sort of trained my brain to the short story. I could recognize an idea that could be made into a short story. Now, I suppose as I said, I started this book thinking that I was writing a short story. When I was writing Jar's section, that was the initial starting point for me. But I quickly realized it wasn't going to be that. But so I think now it's just a case of I write what I need to write, whatever is sort of compelling me to write. Yeah,
And
so that's
yeah, no, which makes sense because I suppose the more experience you get, the more you realize I can do these different things, you know. And I was curious about the themes that you find yourself drawn to, because reading your short stories as well showed me that, like, I suppose two of the themes, not that these are the only themes that you cover, but two of the themes that struck out to me from your work was, one was loss, because loss in all its forms, you know, people who don't even know they've lost something, but they have, and love in all its forms too, both the positive and negatives of both of those, and just these kind of how they stay with people through decades and years. Would you agree that those are two? And what are the other themes that you find yourself constantly mulling over in your work?
yeah. I suppose certainly those two are. I mean, they're the things that keep us all
Yeah.
up at night. You know, they're the issues. Uh, Isolation and sort of exile and loneliness are probably other ones that have you know, really influenced my work. This book, obviously, it's this is a book about family, you know,
Yeah.
and the connectedness of generations. Uh, and I think that's something that has been with me for a long time, that I've been trying to make sense of. Uh, Loss certainly is a big one, you know.
Yeah.
But for example, when I was writing, I had a novel a few years ago called My Coney Island Baby, and when I was writing that, there was a section in the book that I knew there was something missing in one section of the story, and I couldn't figure out what it was. And then I woke up one morning and I realized that the main character, Michael, had a child that died.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And I started writing that, and I realized that I was basing that on a memory I had from. I had a brother that died as a baby, and it was I was basing it on the impact that it had on my parents.
Gosh.
You know,
Yeah.
seeing that as a child, and so you know these things are, you know, they're fundamental to us all. You know, they're such a part of life. You know, I was I was kneeling on the ground next to my grandmother when she died,
Wow.
at her
Yeah.
bedside, and it was something that we were never shielded from. It was just part of life. So that's, you know, that does seem to be you know, an ongoing trauma that I'm trying to come to terms with. But no, it's you know, these are the questions, I suppose, of that face us all. You know, that we're all struggling with. You know, love and death. They're the big
Yeah.
ones.
Aren't they just? And yeah, I mean, just you speaking there about unknowingly almost exploring this very difficult period of your parents' life and their family's life. Did writing about that and other similar topics, does that, like, I know it's a cliche to ask, oh yeah, does that bring catharsis of some form? I know it's a very cliche question, but I do wonder sometimes, does writing about these things actually kind of clear some sort of a space for you as a writer, or just give you some other perspective? Like, would it be too much of a cliche to say that happened with you, or how did it work for you?
No, I think it's about, you know, it's about you know, maybe finding out about yourself. It's a kind of self-knowledge, or you know, an understanding of you and your place in the world. And I think I wouldn't go so far as to say that it's cathartic, but it probably is for some. You
Yeah.
know, I never kind of look at it that way. but it gives me an understanding of it. It gives me a better sense of it. You know, it's you know, it's like facing something. You know, it's you know, you can bear it better when you kind of look it in the eye. You know, and I think when you're writing about something, you know, that's deeply personal, you come to terms with it in a way. It doesn't, you know, it doesn't make things better or worse, but it does give you something. It gives you know, an acceptance almost of it. You know.
And have you had people say similar things to you, that from reading your work that they have maybe come to terms with things, or just been touched by the fact somebody's gone through something similar, or you wrote about an emotion they felt?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I wrote Coney Island, the Coney Island book, I got some interesting responses from it. I got a few angry responses as well.
Really?
You know, yeah, because
What
I
did
mean,
they say?
the book was the book was about a 25-year love affair, an ongoing love affair, and there was reasons for writing it that way. That you know, it was there were aspects of the book that were based on my own, or you know, it was me trying to work out issues from my own life. But you know, I mean, I'm not married. I wasn't having a 25-year affair. You know, it was. But I got a couple of. I mean, I got one email, and somebody absolutely berated me for writing a book about such a thing.
Gosh.
You know, as an affair, that they're terrible things, and you know, we all know that, but that's not, you know, that's not the reaction you expect. So, you know, I mean, I got actually, I have to say that with Life Sentences, with this book, I've had the most responses to any of my writing so far in just the few weeks that it's out. I've had so many reactions from people, and they're, you know, the timing of the book, that's just you know, luck of the draw maybe, but the book came out just at the time that the mother and baby home story was breaking, you know. And I think maybe there's something about this book that resonates with people, you know, because they you know, I don't want to say we're becoming less judgmental, but maybe we're becoming a bit more open-minded to other, you know, other people's circumstances. So I've been really happy with the responses to this book, and you know, the things that people have said, that you know, it made them, or you know, they remembered their own grandmother or some situation from their own past that it reminded them of, or something in it, you know, which is great. You know, it's lovely to get that. But I mean, you know, even if the book was never going to have been published, I still had to write it. It was still a book that I was going to write anyway. So so while it's fantastic to get responses, you know, they're in a way, they're kind of incidental to the whole thing, because you know, it's a personal book, I suppose, you know, in that sense.
Were you nervous at all though about writing such a personal book? You know, because it's clear that you, like you're saying, that you felt it was in you and you had to write it. But was there ever a moment where you thought, wow, this is really personal to me and strangers are going to read it, you know?
Well, I think it was fine while I was writing it, but when I knew it was going to be published, maybe some doubts started to creep in, you know. I mean, the names of the people are used in the book.
These are the real names.
Yeah, I mean, I had to, you know, there were names had to be modified a little bit, because in Ireland everybody is named Mary at that time. And so, for example, Ger's wife's name is Mary, his sister's name was Mary, his daughter's name was Mary, and his mother's name was Mary. So we had to, you know, try to come up with variants of those. and it wasn't hard because his daughter was known as May anyway, so that was an easy change. His sister was known as Mamie, which was a kind of a pet name for Mary. And even though his mother's name was Mary, she was known as Nan. So she became Nancy in the book for the, for the purposes of, otherwise, hello, said Mary, to Mary.
Yeah.
Where's Mary?
In front of Mary.
Yeah, it would have become that. So yeah, that had to be changed. But other than that, I mean, it's laying it on the line a bit, all right. And I suppose I have to admit, I was a little bit nervous about what some of my relations would have thought of the book,
Yeah. Did you send it to anybody in advance or run it by them, or did you feel, look, I just need to get it done and we can deal with that afterwards?
No, I didn't, because what was the point? It was coming out, there's nothing, when I first started writing in a kind of a serious way, it's natural to kind of hold things back and say, I don't want my mother reading that, and then you quickly realize that you can't shock your mother. There's nothing you can do that will shock anyone. We're past all that. So I think it's a book that it's written as honestly as I could write it. I think it's respectful to the people's stories, to their lives, and I don't think that's something to feel bad about. I think it's something to admire. I think in a way, that what they had to overcome. I mean, if it was me today, I'd curl up and die in the gutter. That would be it. I wouldn't have the strength to endure that. So they have my admiration.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible, and I think, like what you kind of were talking about there too, you're telling an Irish story, like an Irish working class, or people who haven't even reached working class status in Ireland, and who are living history that so many people did live, and it's important for people to tell every inch of our country's history through individual stories, as opposed to just leaving history to certain people to write about. And we've got some questions from people, so some of them are really, really interesting. So before we finish up, I wanted to put them to you. There was one here, if I can just find it. I think it was, do you approach writing female narrators or the female point of view differently from male characters whose lives are very different from your own? Now, obviously, they were your relations, but did you approach writing the female point of view any way different at all? Or
I didn't. What I was trying to do in the book, and maybe this is something that only I'll be aware of, is that I was actually trying to write the voice of a bloodline, if you like, and so when it passes from generation to generation, it's a continuation, it's meant as a continuation, and that was my intention with it. As to how people will read it, well, I can't control what people will do, how they'll view it. But that was one of the things that I had in my head. Also, I wanted it to fit. I wanted the voices then as well to fit the characters in as natural a way as I could. Obviously, the only one that I would have met was my grandmother. The rest were dead before me. But I tried to put a voice to the characters as I knew them, as I imagined them, I can't say differentiated between whether they were a man or a woman. I was just thinking of it on the level of characters.
And you're in there as well as a kid in the book. What was it like writing about yourself as a smallie?
Well, I suppose again, that was only done just to give a sense of things moving on, you know, and continuing on. And that part of the book, for obvious reasons, is the most personal part to me, because, you know, I don't even have to close my eyes and I can see that room just exactly as it was, you know. And I could see, you know, if I could draw well, I could draw my grandmother's face. I stared at it that much as a child, you know.
Wow.
And so I suppose for that reason, you know, like also, you know, she used to keep me at home from school to tell me stories. She would say, she'd say to my mother, "The child is too sick to go to school today. He has an awful cold." And she'd sit me by the fire and she'd tell me about the Black and Tans, or, you know, tell me about her father, or her own school days, or, you know, and so it just felt right to put me in there in you know, in a small way, you know. I'm only, you know, I don't interfere too much in the story, but I'm just there at the tail end. Yeah, so that's.
I enjoyed that. I thought it was nice for breaking the fourth wall. And we've got a question here as well, one that we haven't touched on yet, that I wanted to ask you about, the kind of modern or contemporary authors that you admire or that might influence your work in any way.
Oh, the list is so long, you know. I mean, I read constantly. I'm reading constantly. I don't, you know, when I like something, I want to read more of that writer. And I just I read everything, you know. I read everything that comes to hand. I love foreign language books. I always have, you know, from back in my teens, or I love the idea of, you know, a writer that will bring me to Japan.
Yeah.
Or, you know, I mean, I know what Ireland looks like. I can look out the window and see it. And so that still is a big part of my reading, you know. And I go through phases of different writers, you know. And it's nothing like my own type of writing necessarily. You know, the South American writers, the magic realism, and then all the stuff that came from that. I find that very appealing. But there's none of that in my writing. It doesn't come into it. I like some of the American writers, you know. I always liked. I always had a fondness for American writers when I was young. Steinbeck and people like that, Hemingway now. And then after that, it was John Updike. I loved him. I loved his sentences, and I liked reading people like Norman Mailer just because of how awful they could be and not be apologetic for it. You know, they and somebody like Norman Mailer would write these big, you know, these big awkward kind of books. And I was just always astonished by just the scope of his ambition. Even when he failed, it was something worth reading. I liked reading Anne Tyler. I still like to read her. And I like to read Louise Erdrich. I like her books. Who else? I like to read John le Carré.
A good old spy story in between the magic realism and
I think you
journeys.
And you know, the other thing as well is I couldn't write it, you know, in a million years, but I read poetry every day.
Oh wow.
I love to read poetry. I couldn't write it, but when I'm writing, I'll often get up from what I'm doing and I'll go and I'll pick up a collection of poems and I'll read a few a few lines, and I find that it just forces me to pitch my own sentences that little bit, look for a bit more from myself. So that's it. I mean, I suppose I could start, calling out writers all day long, but we'd never get to the bottom of it.
I know, and I always find asking, when you ask somebody kind of on the spot about who they're reading, or, I'm the kind of person myself where I just forget. I'm like, books? What are books?
Yeah.
So I understand that when some people, when they're put on the spot, are brilliant at naming off readings, but like you say there as well, you have so many people that you read. It's clear that you're a very voracious reader, and that I'm not surprised to hear that when I think about your sentences as well, because you strike me as someone who spends a lot of time on your sentences, and I think that really shows because they're so well crafted. Would I be right in thinking that you do that?
Absolutely. I mean, I suppose when I would look in the direction of Irish writers, it was maybe first and foremost, it was probably John McGahern. But then, and with short stories, it was William Trevor. But it was John Benville was the bear.
What sentences? Yeah.
And so, like, influences come from everywhere, and I suppose where it's very hard to identify them, what influenced you. It's just the more you pile in, the more flavors there are. So yeah.
It completely, and we sometimes don't even know what it is that's inspiring us. We're coming up to nearly an hour, but before we finish off, we had a question about this, and I wanted to ask it as well. It was about your writing routine, what it is, and then also the person kind of wanted some advice around that. So maybe when you tell us about how you developed your writing routine, you could maybe give a little bit of advice to people who are trying to get one together, because it's hard for a lot of people and they want to know the secret. So do you have the secret to getting a writing routine together?
As it happens, I do.
Good.
I think the only way to do it is to read a lot, right? That's where you learn how to write, is by reading, and by putting your backside in the chair and doing it every single day. No excuses. Like for a good few years, I would get up at 6 a.m. I would write until noon every single day.
Wow.
No excuses. No days off. And if you're doing that, you're going to accumulate work. Like with the lockdown, I was writing even more than that.
Wow.
I wasn't getting up so early, but I was writing until 9 o'clock at night every day from morning straight through. And I think once you're in something, once you have an idea, once you're working on something, it becomes easy because it's something to do. It's, you turn up, and if you feel passionate about what you're writing, then it will happen easily. I think not that the work will happen easy, but you'll actually look forward to sitting down and doing it. The advice is just to do it. People always say to me, I don't have time. I don't have time to write. And my answer to that is, if you have time to watch the news, you have a half an hour to spare in the evening to write. If you watch Coronation Street, you have way too much time on your hands. So it's a matter of choice. You have to decide if you're going to do it, and if you do it, then you just have to commit to it.
Yeah, it makes sense. It's kind of, I think sometimes we want these to have like a special magic answer, but the answer is just we have to do the work, right?
Yeah. And it's true of everyone. I mean, you look at somebody like, we'll say, Stephen King, and you see these big 800-page books coming out twice a year. They don't write themselves. Somebody has to sit down and put the hours in. So that's something that I think can't be emphasized enough.
Completely. A friend of mine once was saying that Graham Greene wrote 500 words a day. I think that's a pretty achievable amount for someone, especially if you're not used to writing every day. So even setting a couple of hundred words a day, I don't know.
Yeah.
Now I haven't written any novels, so
Well,
don't take advice from me, but Graham Greene did and you have, so.
Yeah, Hemingway used to do the same. He used to write
Yeah.
500 words a day,
Yeah.
every day, and he used to write standing up
Wow.
to sharpen his concentration.
Makes sense.
Which, yeah, it does, I suppose. But like it's if you think of the big picture, you can get daunted by it, But if you count the words on a page, there's 300 words or 350 words on a page. Well, if you write one page a day, at the end of a year, you have 365 pages written, just finding something that's manageable to yourself, to your mind. Whether it'll be publishable or not is a separate question, but that can happen if you put the work in, you rewrite. And when I wrote Coney Island, I spent 7 years writing it. Now, I wrote other things. I kept having to put it aside and write other things, but things take as long as they take. Sometimes they come easier than others, but that's the joys of it.
I think that's a really nice bit of advice to leave people on. But before we leave people, can we expect, are you working on another project, even though obviously Life Sentences is out now and everybody should go and buy it if they don't have it already, but when they finish that, they'll no doubt be saying, oh, well, can we expect more short stories or other projects you're working on?
Well, I have a novel cooking.
Great stuff.
As to whether, who knows what will happen with that, but that's where I am at the moment. That's what I've been spending my lockdown doing. So
brilliant. So that's great for us. Thanks so much, Billy, for all of that wonderful chat about your writing process and your book, Life Sentences.
Guys, that was marvelous. I'd like to thank Billy and Aoife for an absolutely fantastic hour. It was such a pleasure to tune into that, and I hope all of you who joined us tonight enjoyed it. And just to remind you, as Aoife said, Billy's new novel, Life Sentences, is out now. It was published last month by Jonathan Cape and Penguin Books Ireland. And I would strongly encourage you all to go out and get a copy, but to get it from an actual bookshop, as they need our support now more than ever. Obviously, we'd like to give a shout out to our own local bookshop, Bantry Bookshop, and I would encourage you to buy the book from them or from your own local bookshop, wherever it is that you live. So hopefully you'll enjoy it. It's an absolutely fantastic read, and hopefully we'll get the opportunity to meet some of you in Bantry this summer. All going well, our dates will be the 9th to the 16th of July, and we'll be with you in some form or other, but hopefully in person. And we'll be planning other online events between now and then anyway, so please do keep an eye on our social media and our website. So thank you to everybody, and a huge thank you and bula bus to Billy and Aoife for a fantastic event. So thank you all so much.
Yeah, thanks, Emer. Thanks, Aoife, and thanks everyone for stopping in and listening to us. And hopefully you enjoyed it, and hopefully you'll enjoy the book. Okay.
Yeah. Thanks so much.
We'll do the big Zoom wave now.
Yeah. Bye.
Good night. Thank you all. Bye.